So this session this afternoon, or this evening, explores the troubled interface between classics and art history in the contemporary academy. It will also introduce a recent project on modern classicalisms, which has tried to rebuild some academic bridges between classicists and art historians, and no less importantly, between the Courtauld and King's College London. Michael Squire is reader in classical art at King's College London, where he curated the Classical Now exhibition at Somerset House and Bush House in spring 2018. His recent edited volumes have explored sites and the ancient censors, late antique picture poetry, framing devices in classical art, Lessing's Laocoon, Greco-Roman ornament, Hegelian aesthetics, and embodied objects. If you'd like to join me in welcoming our speaker.
Many thanks, and especially thanks to Eddie, but also to Fern and to Alex for asking me along and inviting me to be undisciplined. Originally, I think undisciplined had a question mark, but we've all been suitably undisciplined enough for the question mark to have disappeared. I'm slightly the odd one out in what follows because I'm very aware that I'm something of a one-man band standing here without any friends alongside me. When Fern and Alex first invited me to talk a little bit about classics and art history, I wanted to use this to kind of stand on a soapbox in some sorts of ways, and so I decided to hug the whole session to a single theme. I'm planning to talk for around not more than 20 minutes, 15, 20 minutes at most, and I want to talk around three different themes. The general theme, and in fact the overall theme for what follows, is the disciplinary relationship between classics and art history. I want to talk a little bit about the troubled relationship between the two and the need to build academic bridges between classicists and art historians. That takes me to a second aspect of the talk, where I want to introduce a project that we've been conducting here in London on modern classicisms that, as you heard before, culminated in its first phase in an exhibition here in Somerset House and at Bush House across the road, exploring the legacy of classical forms in modern and contemporary art. And the third and final theme that I wanted to kind of tease out from what follows is about starting this questioning of disciplinary relationships right here at home, to think about the Courtauld, to think a little bit about Kings, and to think about how we might practice what we preach in terms of disciplinary relationships, in terms of institutional relationships here on the Strand. So it gets more and more controversial as we go on, so we'll see how we get on. Well, let me then begin by standing on my metaphorical soapbox to think about classics and art history. It seems to me that we have a very difficult relationship between the two, especially in the academic history of classics and art history from the second half of the 20th century onwards. And it seems to me that we're in dire need of re-establishing some of the connections between art historical approaches and ancient historical approaches. I wanted to begin with a scandalously personal anecdote. It regards the university, which I won't name down below, and the figure of the Cnidian Aphrodite. 5 years ago, I served as external examiner at this university and had the great pleasure of remarking, assessing all of the coursework and the examination scripts by finalist undergraduates in the tripos, or subject of classical art and archaeology. The papers themselves were of an extremely high quality across the board, but I was struck when it came to our figure here of Aphrodite in particular about the ways in which these classical students had been trained to think about the statue. They were very good at talking about those classical archaeological traits like the S-curve of the Praxiteles body. They were very good at talking about archaeological and religious context. They were very good at historicizing this statue. But none of the answers to the questions in this exam paper talked about the reception of the statue, the fact that the statue stands at the beginning, of course, of the Western female nude. None of them dared to think about such a concept as the male gaze, hardly revolutionary here in art historical circles, and so on and so forth. That's to say that the ways in which these students had been trained to think about this statue were influenced first and foremost by the deeply historicist frameworks of classical art and archaeology. I was invited to raise the question, and this is where the anecdote comes into play, in my external examiner report to the university. And I wrote, here you can see at the bottom, in the art historical papers, I do still wonder whether more might be done to encourage students to think about issues in broader comparative terms, in particular to bridge the study of classical materials with larger art historical questions. That was me. Here comes my response 3 months later. Sorry, there we go. We too are very pleased by the higher numbers of first-class candidates and so on and so forth. While appreciating your comments about the art historical papers, note the inverted commas, these are in fact classical art and archaeology papers and are not conceived of or taught of within a framework of art history per se, but of classical culture. It would therefore not be appropriate to expect students to address questions outside of their discipline, right? A very firm and official statement of the disciplinary boundaries between being a proper classicist and being an art historian. And it was clear that at this particular university, being an art historian wasn't what was desired. That's an attitude that's mirrored by all manner of other classical art historians too. Think about John Boardman, for example, who, besides saying, I was just reading an article published in the 1980s where he said that classical art history was so much better than art history as a field. In fact, already in the 19th century, writes John Boardman, classical art history was so much more advanced than art history at large today. But he also has to say that why should we want to force Greek and Roman art into anthropological molds and structures, or subject it to the service of ideologies bred by modern concerns with race, gender, or psychology? Let's just enjoy the classical, it's beautiful, and let's historicise it. Glad he's not in the room. Think about another expedient of classical archaeology. James Whitley, in a famous textbook, 2002, the common and usual textbook used by students of classical archaeology still today. All art is material culture. Classical art history is archaeology, or it is nothing. Elaborated in a further little soundbite from 2014. There is nothing at all radical about sprinkling postmodern fairy dust over the traditional objects of classical archaeology and calling the resulting mélange classical art history. Classical art history simply doesn't exist. No wonder that such an expert voice as Christopher Wood had this to say about art historical classicists, namely that they are in fact so lacking in self-assertiveness that they have more or less retreated into a corner of their own, isolated from the rest of the discipline. Nor does any classicist dare to build a case for the unavoidability of their field, indeed any case at all. There is a very poignant and important disciplinary boundary here between classics and art history. Of course, there are a few more poignant echoes or reflections of that disciplinary boundary than the Courtauld itself. If we were looking at the website of the Courtauld 15, even 10 years ago, we would have seen under the research areas classical art up there amongst the other subjects. Today you can see that in terms of research areas, we begin chronologically with the medieval and Byzantine. I would say, by the way, that even this chronological framework of thinking about the history of art is itself part of the legacy of the classical historiography of art historical writing. Now, you may or may not agree with me when I would say that the whole history of Western art is a series of responses to the Greco-Roman, series of attractions and repulsions by equal measure. But I don't think there's any grounds for disagreeing that the discipline of art history is rooted in the Greek and the Roman, that art history is married to the classical, for better or for worse, and whether you like it or not. You could think about going to the 16th century, for example, and what Vasari has to say about the history of painting, sculpture, and architecture, absolutely unimaginable without the precedent of Pliny's natural history, both in terms of its chronological framework, but also, of course, in terms of its rhetorical frameworks for talking about art, or indeed its anecdotes about individual artists. You could go also, of course, to the 18th century, where Johann Winckelmann stands as both the father of classical archaeology and as the father of Kunstgeschichte as a discipline in its own right. There's no avoiding the classical if you want to be an art historian, or indeed to engage with the history of the discipline. Of course, the answer might come that in today's 21st century context, we're thinking about art history in global terms. But ancient art history and ancient art is itself, by definition, global, and we need art historians to remind classicists about that global diversity, even and especially in antiquity. Likewise, the whole project of global art history is bound up with the classical tradition, whether one likes it or not. Global art history isn't, in fact, an invention of the 21st century. As much as we in the 21st century wish it were, it has a much longer history, a history rooted in people like Hegel and Hegelian aesthetics with his system of the symbolic classical romantic, and rooted in the reception of the classical too. Well, very briefly, I know I've only got 8 minutes left. I want to move on to think about what that disciplinary boundary has meant for me in a particular project. One of the few, I would say, advantages of being at the sidelines of the discipline of art history is that it makes us think about our subject and indeed champion our subject in all sorts of different and innovative kinds of ways. I wouldn't necessarily claim that the project that we did at King's on modern classicisms was innovative, but it tried to respond to that need to build a bridge between the classical and the art historical. The project itself was called Modern Classicisms, and it sought to explore the legacy of the classical in the 20th century, the 20th and indeed the 21st, roughly from the 1930s through to the modern day. We chose that groundwork for two reasons. One of them is pragmatic, to appeal to the greatest number of art historians, because again, like it or not, the vast number of students who study art history are studying the modern and the contemporary. In terms of periods, there's a great bias towards the modern and contemporary, so we wanted to throw the classical as a kind of hook, as a bait, to kind of get them to think about our own subjects. So there was a pragmatic reason, but there was also a historiographic reason, in that the story often told about 20th century art is a story where the Greco-Roman and the classical becomes literally passé, where it's written out in a kind of brave new world of modernism. We wanted, through this project, to challenge that historiography, to think about how the classical has influenced the modern, but likewise how the lens of the modern and contemporary can help us to see the classical in a new light, so a kind of two-way dialectic, if you like. The project itself has an online platform, and you can read about it online. The website is creatively called modernclassicisms.com. I wanted, though, very briefly to mention part of the project, which was the exhibition that we held here in London in March and April 2018, where we tried to explore precisely that interface between the ancient and the 20th and 21st century, the classical now. It was a show across two venues. Part of it was in Bush House, and you can see what we did to Bush House there itself, namely what we did to the two statues up at the top. As an expression of modern classicisms, there are a few more poignant architectural monuments than Bush House itself, built in the 1920s in an attempt to combine the classical with the cutting-edge modern day. One of the things we did was involve the French artist Léo Caillard in an installation performance work, dressing up the statues up at the top in a piece that he called To the Friendship Between the Classical and the Contemporary. And I just wanted to introduce that to back up some of the things that were said in the previous session about how working with artists can really help us as art historians redefine our subjects. For me, I think it's artists who have been exploring the interface between the classical, the modern, and the contemporary in a way that art historians have conspicuously failed to do. Part of the exhibition was in Bush House, with pieces like those by Damien Hirst, Mark Quinn, Edward Allington, and so on and so forth. But the other part of the exhibition was over in Somerset House, East Wing, which is now owned by King's, or rented by King's, where, again, we had the aim of juxtaposing ancient works, so whether in bronze, whether in mosaic, whether in ceramic, or in marble, with all manner of 20th and 21st century responses. So one of the first things that people saw, for example, was a Liechtenstein print. Likewise, the perennial Greek vase wasn't just shown alongside numerous other perennial Greek vases, as is so often the case in our museums here in Britain and elsewhere, but alongside a vase by Grayson Perry, significantly called, by the way, a classical compromise. Likewise, the piece was shown alongside a Picasso from the 1952, I believe, where again we tried to explore some of the interfaces between Greco-Roman precedent and the work from the mid-20th century. Again, the aim in all this was to think about that two-way dialogue between the historicist kind of concerns of classicists and the much more diachronic kinds of concerns of art history. We were trying to bring together the sorts of different disciplinary strengths that each subject has and has built into its historiographic framework, but also using each to shed light on the other to create modes of dialogue and discourse between the two. Other rooms, like that of myth, did the same, or likewise that of pose. I want very briefly, in the last 3 minutes, to zoom out to a larger question about, sorry, my PowerPoint keeps on slipping backwards and forwards, a larger question about institutional frameworks. So far in this brief talk, I've done two things. First, I've tried to sketch a little bit about that troubled water between classics and art history. And secondly, I've tried to sketch one particular project that had an aim of building that disciplinary bridge between the two. And I guess one of the things I did want to champion along the way was the way in which that undisciplinarity, if you like, spurs new ways of thinking about the subject. Right? It's not all negative. It can in fact be a spur to further research and indeed engagement, so important for sustaining the discipline itself. But as I said, I wanted to finish with a third and final reflection, which is about institutional frameworks. So much of the project of modern classicisms came about thanks to the partnership between the Courtauld and King's. I myself am based in a department of classics just across the 20 metres away in the King's building, but there's so little contact between what we're doing at King's and what we're doing here at the Courtauld. With thinking about disciplinary boundaries, I think we really need to think about the very conspicuous physical boundaries that separate academics, researchers, and practitioners here in the very heart of London. As I said, Modern Classicisms itself was formed out of a partnership with the Courtauld. Think about our launch event that we did in November with 35 speakers and panels, which was a co-organisation with the Research Forum. Think about the additional elements that we had as part of the project. So, for example, we had a competition asking the question, what does the classical mean to you? Which was open to staff and students at the Courtauld and at King's, attracting 27 submissions in all manner of different media: photography, painting, sculpture, music, choral, hymn, and so on and so forth. This was one of the ways in which we really wanted to bridge that institutional gap. Likewise, the whole project here was designed to be part of the larger project of the Association for Art History's annual conference that, for the first time in its history, King's held, but King's held it in partnership with the Courtauld. So really trying to root this partnership between the two universities here at King's, with the theme, of course, of Look Out. And I know many of the audience will have been at that conference itself. This is the slide that we had in the Great Hall at King's, proudly working together to co-host the 2018 Association meeting for art history. So I really wanted to begin, or rather, I really wanted to end those general sorts of reflections by making us think about this that's separating us. I think it's wonderful to be talking about disciplinarity in the broadest possible terms, but since we're here at the Courtauld, I also think we should be thinking in very practical and pragmatic terms about how we can enact interdisciplinarity through the institutional frameworks of our respective universities. So whether you're interested in classical art history or not, I hope that there's something transferable about the background of this project and the aims of it to all manner of other subjects, fields, and periods too. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that fantastic paper. We will have a spoken word performance starting at 6:10. So we have time for maybe a couple of questions. Is anyone happy to go first?
So my economics question is, how do we open that gate?
I think there has to be a series of two-way conversations. I think we have opened it, right? For the Association for Art History, for 3 days it was open. But since then it's been shut again. So to cite examples, I have a PhD student who wanted to do something at the Research Forum, a reading group last week, and she was denied entrance despite having registered at the gate, here at the entrance of the Courtauld, because she didn't have a Courtauld pass. So I think what we have to do is think in really concrete terms what a long-term strategy is and how we can get there through short and medium-term steps, whether it's through thinking about collaborations for courses, whether it's through thinking about ways in which we can make our respective courses open, transferable to undergraduates and graduates. And I think we have to think about what our respective strengths are. It's very clear what the strengths are here at the Courtauld, right, in terms of being a world-leading art history department, being a department that brings together all sorts of different sorts of practices too, including curatorship and so on and so forth. I think we also have to think about what the strengths of somewhere like King's could be, right? Not least in terms of thinking about something like language provision. For my field, classics, one of the problems of teaching classics in the Courtauld is what you do with Greek and Latin, for example. So I think what we have to do is sit round a table, think about what a long-term vision might be, and think about what short and medium-term steps we can take to get there. I know that's a bit of an evasion of the question, but...
For a very interesting paper. I was wondering whether we could, in a way, kind of return to some of the things that we were talking about in the earlier panel. And I wanted to ask you about, in a way, some of these kind of issues of translation and kind of access to kind of classical studies, if you like, that kind of emerged from the other discussion. And I guess one of the things that I was wondering is whether one of the challenges of classical studies, but maybe kind of, is true for other areas of kind of art historical practice, are the rather unsavory undertones to do with kind of imperialism and the use of classical form to kind of, push forward a kind of geopolitical agendas that, quite rightly, are kind of left a very kind of, bitter aftertaste. And, what are the kind of practices in place now in the, in the kind of community of researchers and in the kind of teaching practice, and that can help in a way overcome some of those concerns? Because I can imagine that might be one of the issues given the kind of much wider audiences that we are talking about today, wanting to engage with.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. The only thing I would add is that those questions, those problems of access are of course pertinent to the vast field of art history, which, at the end of the day is so financially driven, in all sorts of different ways, has all sorts of black spots of history in different ways. I think one of the things that we try to do in terms of a community of classical art historians is to think about the diversity of different ways in which the classical itself has been constructed. So if you're thinking about imperialism, well, that's only, of course, one way in which the classical has been reimagined. And what we have to do is think about this construct of the classical as itself something that's culturally constructed, something that's fluid, and something that's always dependent upon the ideologies of the receiving culture. But I would say that those sorts of problems are actually not unique to the classical. But the other thing I would say is that we desperately need art historians to come and help us to theorize, to think about, and to problematize this material. Otherwise, you leave it to the likes of the university and the sorts of sound bites that I gave you right at the beginning, where this stuff just becomes celebrated, which therefore just perpetuates that kind of problem. So I think the question in itself, my response to the question is precisely that we need to be building those sorts of bridges between the study of the classical historical past and the wider field of art history.
Well, I got the impression that the Vice-Chancellor at Oxford was really basically referring to Mary Beard and that sort of approach that he didn't like. And it seems to me that classicists have been pretty good at sort of looking very much at the reception of classical art from the beginning, and so you have people like Edith Hall and Mary Beard with very, very high media profiles. But I think one of the problems with interdisciplinary approaches, and one of the reasons that hold people back is the idea that the various disciplines won't meet on an equal footing. And there is a tendency in art history, which is a very new discipline, certainly in this country, that unless you've got some literary reference, whether you can refer to some Foucault or or a philosophical idea, that somehow what you're talking about isn't validated, and so you have this slightly obsequious referencing of usually male authorities, and I think what's important with interdisciplinary work is to remember, precisely what it is that the artwork does that texts don't do, and the way, people talk about agency a lot at the moment, but there probably isn't enough real appreciate or bringing out of the agency of artworks. And I wonder how you feel in terms of, when you get an artist to put a t-shirt on the sculpture, are you meeting on an equal footing? It's just a question, but I think that's the real problem with interdisciplinary work.
So there are lots of questions there. I'm not going to mention anything about Mary Beard or Edith Hall, and there's lots to say there too. I wanted to pick up the rhetoric there of interdisciplinarity, right? And following up from the last session, sorry, I can't remember who it was. It was a Christian who talked about, what does it mean to say I am an art historian? Who is an art historian? Right? As soon as you start talking about interdisciplinarity with classics and art history, then I think you're talking about the boundaries between the two. And I guess one of the things I really wanted to say right from the outset is that, I would think of myself as being an art historian before I would think about myself as being a classicist. I know that's about me, but I just mean in general terms, I think we have to be very careful about interdisciplinarity, because the inter starts putting down boundaries between what we're all doing and in the first place. And I guess that's really what I've been trying to say about classics and art history, that actually I think they're parts of the same thing when it comes to dealing with material and visual cultures. It's just that the classical concern is partly historically rooted in the Greco-Roman past, in the same way that a Renaissance art historian is an art historian, as well as interested in Renaissance culture, violence, poetry, or whatever else. There's something very strange about the disciplinary position of classical art history that's been constructed, I think, especially in the second part of the 20th century.
And then one final question.
If we have time.
Yes, yeah.
Following on from this, really, I just wondered if you had any reflections on the difference between the institutional frameworks here and in the US, where classical art history is much more often taught in art history departments.
Yeah, so absolutely, much more than I can say in 1 minute. I think that's brought virtues and vices. I think one of the ways in which that's been talked about, especially by classical art historians in the States, is that things are in a much better position in the States. I think that's sometimes the case, but often not the case. I think they're very much, it's a kind of ghetto that actually has made things worse in various sorts of ways, where you have people in two departments at once. Of course, there are all sorts of different national frameworks here. Germany or France would be others too. I guess just bringing this back, and I guess I wanted to make this the final statement really, is thinking about the Courtauld and the work in which the work that the Courtauld has done and still could do. The Courtauld in the UK was unique for being a place where the study of classical visual and material culture could happen among other art historians rather than a department of classics. And since 2011, that's no longer with us. So I think, in terms of Scott's question right from the beginning, what can we do? I think we have to think about what we want to do and where we want to go.